Hello, everybody. This is the latest edition of Lexington Remembers, our long-standing TV show, which gives us a chance to talk to interesting people and about interesting organizations, and particularly thinking about Lexington as it has evolved over the years. My name is Dan Fenn, and our guest today, I'm happy to say, is the newly installed 24th settled minister of First Parish, the Reverend Ann Mason. She's been in town since the 1st of August, and we're delighted to welcome her to town. For the sake of transparency, I should say that I've been a member of First Parish since 1949 when I moved to town. So, Reverend Ann, we're delighted you're here.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here, Dan.
I was wondering, you had several choices about where you would settle in this stage of your ministry. What caught your eye about First Parish? What caught your eye about Lexington?
Well, I was in the middle of a national job search, so I was looking at the wonderful options that were available to me as a Unitarian Universalist minister, and I was weighing the pros and cons of all the churches that I looked at. And there was something about the writing of the language that described this congregation that spoke directly to me. Something about the probing, gritty sermons that you wanted, and the history of this congregation on the Battle Green, and how First Parish has identified as that strong voice of forward-looking thought in Lexington for its entire history. That really excited me about who this congregation is, who it was, and where we might go together.
For those who missed this, of course, First Parish is the white church on the green. So there was a tone to the material that you got that you liked.
It described the members of the parish as being people that were eager to learn, that are intellectually curious, that are forward-looking, and really concerned with matters of social justice, of how to make this world a better place. Not people that want to exist in an ivory tower and just bask in the beauty of their surroundings, as beautiful as they are. They're people that both know their role in history and don't want to stop there. That they really want to reshape the congregation to move into a direction that will make an impact on the local town and on the world around us. And I wanted to be part of that movement.
The history of First Parish is interesting. The process of picking ministers is interesting. It's different from some denominations.
Absolutely. It's a congregational style polity, which means that the congregation has the ultimate voice. So all members of the church, which unlike when it was first founded, you don't have to be a landowner and a man to be a member. You just have to join the church, and there's no kind of requirement for that. So any member of the church has an equal vote to every other member. And the members of the church elected a search committee to go out and find the people that they wanted to interview for this job. And when the search committee had found their candidate, which was me, they brought me to Lexington for a whole week to meet all the members of the congregation and to preach several times, to get to know the town. And I even got a ride on the trolley and got to see the Old North Bridge and all the sites of the area. And then I had a second sermon, and there was a vote by the congregation to call me as their minister.
So unlike some denominations, there's no body at headquarters that says to Lexington, this is going to be your minister.
No, we don't have any bishops, no popes, nothing like that.
Yeah.
Just lay people and other ministers that are in the work of trying to find the best match.
And actually, a congregation could ordain a minister if they wanted, couldn't
What you mean without all the other rigmarole that the minister has to go through?
Yeah.
They could. They've done that for some people.
Yeah.
But that ordination is only good within that congregation. So most ministers in training want to be ordained through the whole process of ordination so that they can transfer that to any congregation.
So, okay, so the way it works is Lexington or Bedford or Arlington Street or any of these churches around here could just pick somebody they liked and ordain them, but that wouldn't make them a Unitarian Universalist minister.
Right.
Acceptable to any congregation.
In the Unitarian Universalist Association, we have what's called the fellowship. So in order to become a fellowshipped minister, one has to go to theology school, write a lot of papers, do a lot of training, pass a very intensive oral examination, and then be accepted into fellowship. And then a congregation is free to ordain a fellowshipped minister.
Okay, okay. And then you could serve your church
Right.
where you were comfortable and where they were comfortable.
Right.
Okay. Now, this particular church here called First Parish, there are a lot of First Parish, First churches around in neighborhood, in neighboring communities. First Parish means what exactly?
Well, it was the first church in Lexington. So there wasn't a church here 360 years ago. There was a church in Cambridge, and the members of Cambridge Farms, as we were called, I think, as a town, had to walk all the way to Cambridge to go to church. And I think when the roads were muddy and wet, they began to complain that it was or snowy. Well, I think they could go over the snow, but having just survived the spring, I think in some ways the mud season is even more challenging for travel. So they petitioned, and our Puritan forebears established their own parish here in Lexington.
And this congregational control thing, that goes back to Puritan days and in England before they even came over
Absolutely. Yep.
There's kind of a revolt against the Catholic Church and the Church of England.
Yeah, they were resisting the oppression that they experienced in England and brought their own desire to create a land that was more in alliance with their beliefs and their values over here.
So First Parish is a direct descendant of those early Puritans.
It is. Our theology now is very different from what they would have believed, but there was a schism that happened from the Puritans in the early 1800s, and the way that it happened in First Parish was very different than happened in other congregations. Some of our neighboring churches had more of a volatile shift as the theology changed and we became Unitarians, and that defined our understanding of God and our relationship with Scripture in a way that some people in the church were comfortable with and some were not. And so there was a division in a lot of churches. And so now around town greens, you often see a congregational church and a Unitarian church that were formed when the congregation split many years ago. But that wasn't the history of First Parish. There was a much more gentle movement into their understanding of who they were as Unitarians.
In Cambridge, I think there was quite a squabble.
Was there? I don't know about that one.
Yeah, the first church in Cambridge and the first parish in Cambridge. And
Yep.
I think the Congregationalists, as they were called, ended up with the church, the physical meeting house.
Right.
And,
Right.
Now let's see, as I remember, 1692 First Parish was gathered, as they said, when the Great and General Court, the Massachusetts legislature, gave these farming families out here the right to have their own church.
Yep.
So that makes 2017 something of an anniversary for First Parish.
It sure does. We're excited to be celebrating our 325th anniversary.
And
time.
and the meeting, the church building, the meeting house, that was 1847, as I
Right,
remember.
that's right. So there's another big anniversary for that.
So
this is our third iteration of buildings. So there was a very small meeting house that was built on the Commons, and then they outgrew that back in the early days of the church, and they built a second larger one, which then burned down, I do believe, and they had to build a third. But by the time that church and state was beginning to separate, First Parish realized that they were no longer going to get their money to support the building and the minister who worked there from the taxes. And so they removed themselves from the center green and moved to the location where we are now. And so that the church is completely funded by the members of the church, not by the town.
Your predecessor was hired by the town government.
Are you talking about?
Predecessors.
You're talking about Jonas Clark.
Yeah, and even Benjamin Estabrook,
And John Hancock. Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, they were the town minister. They were supported by the town, and they were the minister for everybody who was in the town.
So they were hired by the town, paid by the town. Meeting house was built by the town.
Right.
So there's really no distinction between church and state in those,
Not at the time.
in those days.
No.
Yeah. And as I remember the story, one of the ways that those 18th century predecessors of yours were paid was with the produce of land.
Right.
So-called ministerial lands that ran from Massachusetts Avenue, as we know it, to Waltham Street, around where the high school is.
And I remember that Jonas Clark was given a plot of land, but there wasn't enough trees on that land. And so he had to negotiate with the church to give him enough wood to stay warm in the winter. So that was part of his salary, was the number of cords of wood.
For his own use, yeah. Well, things have changed a little bit. I don't think you'd like to be paid in cords of wood.
I don't know. It wasn't that cold of winter, so I think it.
That's true. That's true. Now, you were in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, when First Parish found you. Well,
Yep.
You born and brought up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania?
I was not. I've lived in a lot of different places, but I had been in Lancaster for 25 years. So I raised my children from the time they were young in Lancaster. I really enjoyed the old feel of that city as well, because it's an historic town. It was actually the nation's capital for one day, kind of when they were en route to Washington.
Yeah.
But a lot of historic buildings and famous characters of American history that are from that era as well. So there's something about being an historic town that I really find some deep roots for myself. I like that.
So how did you end up for all those years in Lancaster, Pennsylvania?
that was just a personal situation with my husband's job, and his family was brought up in Lancaster. Lancaster is one of those towns where people never leave. The children grow up, they go off to college, and they always come back home.
Really?
It's one of the highest percentages of towns that does that.
Is that right?
Yep.
How big a community is it?
About 300,000. It's not
300,000. Wow, it's much bigger than Lexington.
It's bigger than Lexington.
10 times bigger.
Sure. Yeah. And it's a very Mennonite-focused, Mennonite and Amish. And those are people that work the land or that really support now organic farms and things like that are very popular, especially amongst the more progressive Mennonites. But yeah, it was a wonderful place to raise my children, but I was ready for something new.
Yeah.
You know, just a new way of being.
Yeah. Where were you born and brought up then?
I was born in New York City, but I was raised in parts of Pennsylvania, and then in high school I moved up to Clinton, New York, where my mother still lives up there. And I went to Hamilton College, and then I came to the Boston Conservatory to study voice for college after Hamilton College.
Really? So your background is music.
It is music, yes. As a singer, as a stage director. I taught voice for many years. I had a small teaching studio in Lancaster, and when I was going to seminary, I continued to teach. I was working at the Unitarian Church as the director of music, and I was going to seminary and raising my children all at the same time.
Yeah, that's a project.
Well, yeah.
and so how did you get connected with that Unitarian Church in Lancaster?
They were looking for their very first paid choir director, and I applied for the job, and in the interview I realized that, and I didn't really know very much about Unitarians at the time, but what I learned from the minister, Reverend Susan Milner, really drew me into the understanding that Unitarian Universalists respect the religions of all people, and that they try and draw truth from many places. And so in college at Hamilton, I had studied Chinese religion and philosophy. I'd studied Islamic thought. I'd studied philosophy.
Just as an undergraduate?
Yeah, I was getting my liberal arts degree and trying to just broaden my perspective of what does it mean to be a human being?
Yeah.
And what do we know about ourselves as humans through the lens of the Greek philosophers, or through the lens of biblical writers, or the feminist authors that I love to read. I read Margaret Atwood when she was writing The Handmaid's Tale, and now everybody's watching it again.
Yeah.
But I think we learn so much from the writings of different people through their cultural perspective, and that continues to inform me when I'm preparing sermons or trying to decide what to teach the members of the parish, or classes that we might bring out into the community. There's so many ways of understanding knowledge. And I think for me that's what theology's been about. It's more humankind's understanding of what is God or what is not God, rather than what does God require of us. And that's a very human question.
And so you got involved with the Unitarian Church there, but through your music rather than...
That's right.
And then what happened? Because now all of a sudden you're a minister.
All of a sudden I'm here. The church that I served down there went through a series of conflictual relationships with their ministers, and there was a lot of strife. I know that never happens in churches in Lexington, I'm sure.
Very rare.
No conflict, no politics, nothing like that, right?
No.
Like I said, it's a very human institution. But through all of that, the music was one of the central, consistent forces through the church. And people look to the choir and to me as the music director for worship and consistent presence, because I was there for 17 years.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of ministers that came and went during that time. And I was not their minister at that time, but I loved them, and I sang with them, and I helped them to laugh, and I helped them to shed tears when they were singing sad songs. Or so I had a connection with the people because of the music. it's a bridge that's beyond words. It's a way of entering people's hearts.
And at some stage of the game, you decided that you'd like to be a minister.
I did. I have felt that urge to learn a little bit more. People were lifting me up in a way that made me think that they were seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself, which is why we need communities to reflect our best selves, or to encourage us to trust what's inside us, that we might not be able to see ourselves. It was in a difficult time in my life because I was going through a divorce and life was challenging. And one loses one's confidence and one's sense of purpose when you go through that kind of cataclysmic personal loss. And so the community at the church in Lancaster really held me and I held them, and we grew together. And I was given the opportunity to go to seminary and learn some skills that I thought might be useful for me to bring back into the church. And it was also a place where I could ask hard questions that I didn't know where else to take those questions. But I was gifted with a full scholarship at the seminary. And that was a surprise and an honor. And when you're given something that wonderful, you can't say no.
Yeah.
You have to say, really?
So did you go to seminary with the idea of then becoming a minister, or
No.
did you go to seminary because you were curious and interested?
I was curious and interested. I didn't know what denomination I would end up choosing to be. I was raised, I'd been to a number of different Protestant faiths. I was raised Episcopalian, I was a Methodist for a little while, I was a Presbyterian for a little while, depending on where we lived in the country and what church my family was going to. But, coming to a Unitarian Universalist church was a very different experience on a Sunday morning, and the questioning that happened, the lack of liturgy, the openness to experimentation and change was really exciting for me. And as a musician, it meant I got to use secular music, not just sacred music. Anything that I found to be worshipful or to help paint a picture that would describe what the minister was trying to express or concerns that she was lifting up. So I loved the artistic freedom that I had in the UU faith. And I wanted to then deepen that by understanding more about what theology really was and what scriptures, what that meant to me. And
So you thought you could be a better music director by enriching your...
well, that was part of it. Part of it was that I was in my late 30s and I was ready for something new.
Yeah.
And I was only a quarter-time music director, and I wanted a bigger job at some point in my life,
Yeah.
And being recently divorced, I knew that I needed to take care of my family, and I wanted to have a more professional degree. So I wanted to explore and see if that might be within the ministry, but I wasn't quite sure yet.
Yeah.
But I loved seminary. It was a very mind-opening and enlivening place for me to be, without judgment. Although I was the only Unitarian in my class.
Yeah.
Once I decided that I was that, I was the only one there, which was sometimes interesting. I got in a few tussles with some of the history professors that didn't like the way that I looked at history through not just the Christian lens.
Yeah.
But that's the role of, anyone who questions the establishment is going to run into a little conflict here and there.
Yes.
We know about that up here too.
Yes, I've run into that once or twice.
I can imagine.
Not around here, of course.
No.
No. So then you get finished at seminary, you graduate, and then what happened?
Well, then I went to Hershey Medical Center for a year, and I was a chaplain. I studied pastoral care, pastoral counseling, and thought that I wanted to become a chaplain. And that was an amazing year. It was filled with sitting with families in the midst of crisis and learning what it means to be a spiritual presence for someone that isn't necessarily looking for a spiritual presence. They don't know what they need. They know that their loved one was just in a car accident and they just need someone to get them a glass of water and sit with them during the night while they're waiting. And there's a there's a sense of spiritual care that comes with being in the middle of the darkness with somebody that was very powerful for me. You know, I didn't try and tell people what they should believe or what they shouldn't believe. I just tried to be with them in the midst of the tough time and help them figure that out for themselves. And that was a very powerful time for me. But frankly, being a pastoral counselor was, it was so wearing on me emotionally that my husband tells me I used to cry in my sleep.
Yeah.
Because I was like a sponge that just needed to be wrung out. You know, it was just so much for me.
Yeah, I've a couple of members of my family in social work and working with kids and stuff, and it's amazing to me how they can be involved, be present, be caring, be concerned, and still be able to step away and not be totally taken over by these terrible things that other people are going through.
Right. People, I mean, everybody in this kind of profession, social workers, and I think teachers as well. You know, my mother was a high school teacher, so, you know, I watched her care for her students. But in ministry, we really practice self-care, learning how to step away a little bit and to consciously cultivate joy so that you remember that that's there too. Because you can't live as a worker if you give over all of the things that replenish you. You can't be there for somebody else. I often think about the sign in an airplane that says, you know, place the oxygen mask over your own mouth before you help your children, because if I'm not taking care of myself in some way, I can't help anybody. So that was something that I really had to work on.
And that's a characteristic, a trap even of the ministry.
Could be,
isn't it?
Well,
I mean, you have to be available. It isn't just a Sunday morning job. You have to be available 7 days a week.
Yes.
24 hours a day. So how do you do that?
Well, I experienced that the members of First Parish are very respectful of my time off. So they actually encourage me to take time off when I might not be willing to do it because I'm so motivated to work.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And so I'm careful about that. But I will tell you, there was a day in chaplaining when I spent the morning at the bedside of a member of the church in hospice who was dying. And in the afternoon, I spent the day at the bedside of a mother who had just given birth. Mm-hmm. And having both of them in the same day made me think, maybe parish ministry is a better balance for me. Mm-hmm. Because I can have the joy of the lightness of people. I can do the weddings, not just the funerals. Mm-hmm. And so for me, being able to do both weddings and funerals, you know, and I had a child dedication recently, you know, to see the light in the eyes of those parents and the beauty of that little face, you know, it just brings joy back into the world and say, yes, it's still here. Mm-hmm. You know, even though this person over here may be suffering, there's still beauty and love in that suffering. Mm-hmm. And I can be more resilient if I spend time also with the youth group playing silly games for a while, or just being at coffee hour and talking about the news, or talking about what we want to do in the world, or talking about buying a new house, or, you know, the other things that we talk about just in regular community life.
It's an absorbing profession in so many ways, and I wonder at people's ability to handle all its aspects, because you have Sunday morning, sort of the centerpiece of the week for church week for most of the parishioners, and
Right.
then this pastoral, and you got an institution to. I mean, you know.
Absolutely. There's 250 members of the church, so there's getting to know all the people, but there's also the administrative piece of that. There's supporting the staff so that we have a wonderful music director in Rip Jackson and an incredible educator in Lisa Maria Steinberg, and supporting them in their work as well, because, everybody needs to have some place to go to get some support and some encouragement so that they can do their work as well.
So as far as the institution of First Parish is concerned, you're the CEO and the CFO and the development officer? And
No, I wouldn't say that. No, I'm the spiritual leader. I mean, I'm the head of staff, but First Parish is comprised of very, very capable individuals who take their volunteer roles very seriously. And I suspect that that's probably across Lexington, that people in this town, if they say yes, they're going to do something, they do it very well. Mm-hmm. They understand the role of volunteerism. They value that, I think, as a society. That's highly regarded. Mm-hmm. And I admire and respect that. Mm-hmm. So that all the volunteers with which I've worked at First Parish have been incredibly diligent about what they do. Mm-hmm. And sometimes my job is to bring joy and lightness into that diligence, mm-hmm. so that we can have fun together doing the work that we do together. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't feel like, oh, here I go again, but it feels like, oh, I get to do this.
Yeah.
To this end, to make this wonderful thing happen. Mm-hmm. I think our building and grounds people have done an amazing job. They had a huge installation to prepare for. When the church installed me just about a month ago. The entire church was cleaned, the flower beds were done, there was painting, there were work parties every Saturday for hours on end. And, I think there's a lot of pride in the actual beauty of the building of First Parish. We're going to be replacing some windows and raising some money to restore the building so that it's what it needs to be on the Battle Green. And people do have pride in that. I hope all of Lexington has pride in that, because it's really a church for the whole town, not just the congregation members.
Yeah, well, its position there on the green makes it a kind of a
That's right.
special part of the green.
That's right.
Part of the town.
Right, and we started a new series this year called Voices on the Green, which has been very well attended. We brought it was kind of a TED talk by a main speaker, some of which have come from our congregation and some of which have come from the community. And then there were 3 or 4 people that would tell personal stories, kind of like the Moth Hour radio show, which is an incredible program. And then there were musicians from the local high school that came and performed. And we had hundreds of people come and listen to the stories of our own people, the voices of Lexington, mm-hmm. that are being lifted up and given a place of honor to be shared on mm-hmm. the green, because the mm-hmm. green belongs to everybody.
And there's a music program aside from Sunday morning.
Right. So Rip Jackson has several concerts that he does with the choir, or he brings in guest musicians. They've done folk music. We just did an incredible Broadway cabaret. Just raised the rafters. I think those old windows were shaking a little bit. It was pretty exciting. And then there's also a number of wonderful organizations, choral groups, the Master Singers, and other groups like that. The Hallelujah Singers come and perform there. The Spectrum Singers have performed there as well, I believe. So there's a number of really good choral groups that come in and do concerts. We have a pianist named Yuki who's doing a recital in June. And mm-hmm. all of those are open to the public. Mm-hmm. We love people to come to those. Mm-hmm. It's not just for church members.
And Rip does the Sunday morning services. With your background as a musician, you must be particularly interested in the Sunday morning music.
It's very important to me. We spend a lot of time together planning planning the flow, the emotional flow of the service, because we want the music to lead into the next piece, which would be spoken word, and the spoken word then leads into the next piece of music, and together it creates an atmosphere through which people are encouraged to deepen and relax into their own selves, and then to be engaged with questions. And sometimes, I don't know about for you, Dan, but sometimes my mind gets so busy with everything that's going on in the world around me, and the radio's on, and there's people around, and the phone's ringing, and it's like a million things happening.
Yeah.
And Sunday morning is the 1 hour where people can come and just be. No phones, right? No video games, just some live music, some space to breathe, an encouragement to go deep and listen to your own thoughts, wrestle with your own questions, listen to the minister, hopefully whatever questions that I might bring up during the sermons, and then celebrate together when we sing together and everybody's spirits are lifted up.
But why couldn't I just sit in my living room and watch a broadcast or my iHop or whatever those things are?
Your iPhone.
Yeah, well, that's what they
iPhone
call
that you
me.
take to the IHOP to have pancakes with.
I see, okay.
There's something about being in physical space with somebody else that is different. I think our society is becoming more and more isolated from each other because we really do have so much of the world at our fingertips. But, when I'm sitting in my space and the person next to me is moved by something that's happening, I can feel their reaction. I can tell if they're catching their breath because they're feeling sympathy for something sad that they've heard. Or I might even lean over and pass them a tissue if I know that they're mourning the loss of their parent who just died. And that sense of connection and community, you can't have that by yourself with the screen. You need to go through it together. You need to breathe the same air.
Well, why is it, in Europe, nobody goes to church anymore. And the numbers that I've read in the United States, the amount of going to church on Sunday morning has dropped off tremendously. Why?
I think people are being raised without that sense of culture of needing other people. They're isolating from each other. There are other places where I see in the millennials a real desire to come together. So I think even at the Cary Library, didn't they have one of those death cafes where you come together and talk about living and dying and what's important? There's supper clubs where people get together to talk about grief. There's ways that people are choosing to connect in small groups that aren't necessarily connected to the church. But my fear is that people think that church means you're going to be told what to think and that you better not have your own thoughts because the church's job is to tell you how to be and what to think. And I think that drives people away because, especially in a town like Lexington, people want to come up with their own answers. Children are being raised to think for themselves, to love to learn, to want to investigate. When you have the whole world at your fingertips and you can look up anything you want to look up, you do develop that kind of curiosity. Well, let me just find out for myself. I don't need you to tell me. I'll go look it up. I might just look it up on Wikipedia, but at least I'm looking it up, right? So our church is a place where discussion is encouraged and questions are really important. When our children come to the age of 13 and 14, we have a program called Coming of Age. And we just had that program last week, and I heard the children say, I'm an atheist, but I believe in love. Or I'm an agnostic, and I just, I don't want to have to define what I believe just yet, but I believe in community. And I know that when I come to church, I feel the power of the community of people with me, and that's important. And so people are encouraged to claim what it is that's important to them.
But what, I mean, I can, go into a classroom, or I can be a member of a service club, or, and be with people. What's different about being in the church on a Sunday morning?
Well, we are a faith tradition, so there's something about what faith means to people that pulls that changes that question. I mean, I think service clubs are really important for people, but the purpose of that, I understand, is just to do certain activities in town. And those are, I don't know who decides which activities they'll do. And I think those are very important activities for the people that do them. But the purpose of a church goes beyond the activity. It goes more into, how do I choose to live and exist in this world? How do I, with every decision that I make, where I live, what I eat, where I shop, do I spend extra money to buy organic vegetables because I know it's better for the earth? How do I care for my children? Do I send them to a public school so that they can be in the mix of more people, or do I protect them in a private school so I can really shape exactly how they're going to learn? These are all questions that every parent has to face. And being in a faith tradition where you can be with other people asking, how do I want to be in this world? Maybe I have to resist the tide a little bit. Maybe everybody else in my neighborhood is doing one thing, but it doesn't feel right to me. So having a safe place where you can actually shape questions and be vulnerable with each other. Coming to church isn't about being perfect. Far from it. It's about bringing your whole self. And receiving nurture when maybe the day that I'm in church, I'm feeling sad. I lost my father-in-law recently, and the people at the church knew about that and were very caring to me as the minister. I'm not just over here. I'm part of the mix of people.
Part of the whole fabric.
Part of the fabric. And so, to share my sorrow and to have people say, I know I just lost my mother last year. I know exactly how it feels.
Yeah, and if you're coaching Little League football, that you don't say to the kids or the other coaches, gee, I just lost my father-in-law. But
you don't.
In a church you do.
That's right.
So how does one reach people who are unchurched, who either have had no experiences as a child or experiences that they reject? I read in the paper about all these unchurched people, and I've seen the figures in our own area here.
Well, I think one of the things that excites me about that question, Dan, is that being the new minister in town, I really want to meet people who aren't going to church and figure out, what is it that's needed? And what is it that some people think of when they think of church that might not fit who we are at all? I think people make assumptions about a church, that it's a certain way.
Yeah.
And it's got that kind of old churchy feel to it, right? They think they have to be all dressed up and whatever.
Well,
half our people show up in sneakers and jeans. It's just show up and be comfortable, right?
Yeah.
And just be yourself.
I don't really think God cares. I mean, I figured, being so old and stuff, that if you don't dress up to go to church, when do you dress up? But that's not the common feeling now.
And for people that have to dress up all week long.
Well, that's true.
you know, speaking as a woman, I wouldn't want to have to put on that pair of high heels 6 days a week if I didn't have to, right?
Yeah, right.
You know,
right.
so it's good to be comfortable, but for some people, they want to dress up, and that's fine too.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, being at the beginning of my ministry, I think First Parish is poised to just begin to say, who are we? How do we want to change? How can we reach out to people that don't know about us and invite them in? And here's the piece that excites me about that. Because when you invite somebody in, we have to change. We can't invite somebody in and say, we only want you to walk in the door because you're going to be like us. We have to say, we want you to walk in the door and see what happens to us because of your presence, that you might make us change. And that might make us uncomfortable, but it might make us really excited. And in the end, might make us much better than we ever dreamed we could be.
Yeah, you know, the term diversity we commonly think of as skin color or eye shape or something like that, but when Reggie Gibson and I were talking, I told a story about a friend of mine, a professor in New York, and it's a professor that prides themselves on their, quote, diversity, close quote. And Neil said, hey, we're not diverse at all. We're exactly the same. Our skins may be different color,
right.
but it's the same. We're the same people.
Right.
We're just clones.
Wow.
And so what you're talking about is real diversity, people who think differently, feel differently, act differently.
I think that we all fall prey to the overarching culture of our country that always feels like it was defined by somebody else, right? The
ubiquitous they.
Yeah, the ubiquitous they. But there is a mass culture, I think, that tries to pull everybody in. You know, when in America, the history of America, we called it a melting pot because we wanted people to come in and leave their language, leave their traditions, leave that at the door and come and be American, which meant to be Eurasian, really. I mean, the culture that the Europeans brought, Northern Europeans brought, was the accepted culture. And I think one of the great tragedies of our country is that we've marginalized people that weren't from that white European culture. And said,
over and over
and
again.
We're continuing to do it. It's really important that we begin to say white culture is not the only culture that's acceptable. That it's what has forced everybody else to let go of what's important to them. And we need to find a way to shift that so that we all can be changed by each other. And recognize that, yes, we are different, beautifully so, wonderfully so. We're not just all the same. Yes, we all have the same blood. Yes, we're all human beings and we're all valuable equally. But within the value of that, there needs to be respect for the differences that we bring. Differently abled, different ages, different shades of skin color, different gender identification, anywhere on the spectrum that we might be, those things bring such richness to a community because we can define ourselves by all of that and not say, oh, you can only walk in the door if you look like me or sound like me or like my music. That's what's kept churches as the most segregated hour. Sunday morning at 10 o'clock is the most segregated hour in the whole country. It still is. And I find that a crying shame. I really do. So if we're not willing to be changed by someone else's presence, then we can't be in the business of saying that we want people to come in and visit.
And really, in some ways, fundamental change. I mean, my classmate Tom Kuhn wrote a famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and he said the really exciting, dramatic new discoveries come from a paradigm shift. And where you're so used to looking at things this way, and you forget that there are other ways of looking at things, and new people from new backgrounds coming in create those paradigm shifts for all of us.
That's right.
Where does that say something about where you'd like to see First Parish
Absolutely.
be in the next 5 years?
I would love First Parish to wrestle with how it's still influenced by the founding fathers, who were only the landowners, and the men who were able to vote. And there were lots of marginalized people that lived in the area that weren't allowed to belong to First Parish. And what happened to them? And why weren't they invited in? And how can we look back at our history and say, let's radically rethink our existence and become a place where you don't have to be wealthy, you don't have to be a landowner, you don't have to be a certain ethnic background in order to find your place. And I would love to see First Parish become as diverse as Lexington itself, economically speaking. You know, we need people of all walks of life to come in our doors. You know, we need people from, there's so much more racial and ethnic diversity in Lexington than there was 20 years ago.
Oh.
And we want to embrace that and find a way to encourage people to come in and find in First Parish a sacred place to design and declare what is sacred to you, what is your pathway. Because we don't say that you have to do a certain religious pathway or another pathway, right? In the congregation that we have people that were raised Christian and say, I'm not sure I can handle all of that, and others that are still Christian. And we have people that are Hindus and people that are Buddhists and people that are atheists. We have some pagans. We've got people that find the holy in a lot of different ways. We have a lot of scientists that say, don't even use the word holy. You know, I find meaning in life by the clarity of the science that I can understand and recognize and continue to explore. And that's what the world is for me. And I think there's room for all of those. I mean, there has been. That is the beauty of the tradition.
One thing though, if I come Sunday morning and which I do, and sit in pretty much the same pew and participate in the service, listening to what you have to say, and go to the social hour afterwards. But I'm not talking to somebody else about what I think about the Bible or God or Jesus or the great questions of why we're here and where we're going and all that. I mean, in coffee hour, I'm talking about whatever happened the week before.
Sure.
Well, where does that interchange happen?
It depends on the level of your engagement with each other. I mean, if you're just making small talk with somebody, that's what people do to kind of be comfortable in the space. But if you're looking for a deeper connection, I see that happening at coffee hour all the time.
Oh?
I do. I see people, there's a way that you can tell someone's body language. They're sitting there with their cup of coffee and they're being kind of like, la 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 la, and then all of a sudden they're like,
yeah.
You know, they connect. And it might be just they're looking in their eyes and going, yeah, I get it. I've been there. And you see that kind of interaction all the time. But we also have classes that people attend. We have meditation groups that people come to. We have a nonfiction book group that people decide amongst themselves what they're going to read and study together, and they come and they really engage on those big questions. I think next week they're reading Reverend William Barber's book on the Third Reconstruction about the work that he's been doing in North Carolina, that interfaith work to really affect the political process. You know, we're talking politics, we're really talking theology. We're talking what do we believe? And how is that impacted by what's going on in the country around us? You know, do we like it? Are we resisting it? Where do we stand? You know, when we're talking about possibly becoming or supporting the Bedford Parish and becoming a sanctuary church, we're talking radical politics there, right? And that's based on our desire to make this world a better place. That's not small talk. That's big stuff.
That's real stuff.
Yeah.
That's real stuff.
Yeah.
Well, we're glad you're in town, and we hope this all turns out to be as exciting a part of your journey as it promises to be.
Thank you. Well, certainly it's been off to a great start, and getting to know people like you, Dan, has been just such a delight.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.